Archaeodeath, Death and Memory, Past and Present, with Professor Howard Williams.
Okay, welcome back, and just introduce myself. My name is Professor Howard Williams from the University of Chester. I know that because it says it on the slide. And it's also really great to be here and to get the invitation from Isa, and thanks to him and to his broader team for facilitating me coming over for this event. I've been to York to talk quite a few times, but this is a really special kind of venue for me and context for me, not only the Jorvik Festival, which is fantastic, but also being able to talk to people who are so dedicated and obsessed in a healthy way, maybe, in the designs and the art of the early Middle Ages and the Viking Age specifically. And I think it's always a bit scary to talk outside of one's comfort zone to different groups, different communities, and different people who have such detailed knowledge, as we heard from Isa's talk, about the art of the period. And I really want to take this opportunity to remind you that while this is like really niche topic, this shit really matters. Not only because there's a vast global, thirst, hunger for knowledge and engagement with these topics, whether it's for reenactment, for tattooing, for story, for the materials, for the places, it also matters because there's so many that will grift off it. There's looting, as Isa was saying. There's archaeological sites under threat. We need education to appreciate them, to conserve them, and we need politicians and people that fund research and management of these sites. And this is something that's going to become increasingly difficult. I've had colleagues who've literally had letters telling them they're sacked in the US in the last week because of the new Trump administration's rules on federal spending. And it's not just the loss of their expertise and skills, but it's these sites and monuments in that country are now just up for grabs. No one's there to conserve and protect them and educate about them. And we face that threat here in the UK. We're going to face similar threats to our cultural heritage in coming years around Europe. And so it's important for all of those reasons, and also because people are really keen to misuse this period for all manner of extremist ideologies and hateful narratives. And that's why I think it's really important, while this is niche stuff, we remember that this shit matters. This has real implications on real world issues and today's politics and society. And a lot of what Isa is taking his ideas from is from our burial data. And that's a field of my expertise, of how we look at graves, how we look at the dead. And in death, we see from the Viking Age and before, graves tell us about the things around in people's lifetimes. Also, the very special things they may have made for the funeral and the practices associated with death. And so through funerary evidence, we're getting a glimpse indirectly at life in the past, but also at how people treated the dead. And so what I want to do is, as a kind of, whether you've picked up on any of my publications or any of my colleagues' publications on this theme, because there's a whole host of archaeologists that look at settlements, material culture, hoards, but also from the Viking Age burial ritual, funerary practice, death ritual. These terms get used, and I will probably mix and match them, as Isa was saying. There's so many terms, And I just want to give you some case studies from my own research about how we can approach them, how we can approach the material evidence. And I'm going to say, I called this talk Viking Archaeologies of Death. And I'm going to give you sort of a few case studies that will hopefully show you how this stuff, it gives us an insight into past times, how people may have reacted to death and dealt with the death, but also to point out to you some of the problems of interpretation and how perhaps, and this is always a thing I try to say, there's so much we don't know. Archaeologists don't know much, but we know more than anyone else, but we don't know much. We're still trying to work out from fragments. And also, we're part of the problem. That when I talk about misinformation and disinformation about the Viking Age, I always make the point that academics aren't sitting in an ivory tower going, oh, everyone else is getting it wrong. Why won't they read my specialist report on this very matter? No, actually, we are part of the problem. We're part of the ongoing problem, because a lot of the misinformation and disinformation is not simply coming from old information shared via Wikipedia or 19th century, romanticized, racialized visions of the Vikings. A lot of this stuff is being constantly perpetuated by academics ourselves. So we have a profound responsibility to be honest about what we know and what we don't know, and to try and share the problem of interpretation. And that's what I really want to do in this talk, looking at death ritual in particular. So just to give you a sense of what I get up to, I deal with death in different periods and places. I do field work, I do investigations of monuments and syntheses of other people's excavated data, because we have so much data produced by commercial archaeologists, produced by other research projects, and one of my responsibilities is try and interpret other people's material. And I publish books, specialist books on, here are some of my edited collections and journal special issues, for an academic audience, but dealing with not only different aspects of the early medieval past and funerary monuments and death rituals, but also increasingly I've been doing work with others, collaborating with students and other scholars on how we engage the public with these themes. So I've produced an open access journal called the Offa's Dyke Journal, which is not just about Offa's Dyke, it's about linear monuments, frontiers and borderlands in the early Middle Ages and comparative studies. And so that's open access. And I've also produced, with students, a series of conference proceedings that deal with how we communicate, how we work. And one of the books actually is about art and archaeology, about how we work with creatives to communicate different interpretations, how we work with past art from the Bronze Age or the Viking Age to help tell the stories, and how we use new digital strategies and other kind of artistic creative media to do our research. So there's lots of ways in which I'm, as an academic, I'm interested in what happened in the past and its death rituals, but also how we share that information in new and different ways through open access publications, working with other disciplines and other creative media. And when we're dealing with death ritual in the early Middle Ages, of course, we have to deal with literally a deluge of strange ideas, many of which have grains of truth, have mythological or historical or legendary sources or archaeological materials that speak to them. But there's so much now a part of our world, it's difficult to sort of work out what we're looking at. So here's some film and televisual representations of not necessarily Viking death rituals, but of things that indirectly come from the Nordic mythologies, from via Tolkien or via other fictional media, fantasy representations, particularly burning boats or people embarking on boats, which is, as I will show you, is a part of our archaeological record, is a part of historical times, but is also so much romanticized that for many, this is the Viking way of death. I've got to say it in that voice because that's the only way you have to say it. Viking way of death. Embarking on a journey over water. Even How to Train Your Dragon 2 has this kind of trope, and it's a common trope. And so for me, as an academic, there's two ways of looking at this. There's one is to say, oh, this is all wrong, and I could shout at people at how wrong it is, or I can think of, well, actually, this is part of our modern-day Viking death rituals. People are trying to reenact this in different ways. People are interested in this. So why just shout about why it's not correct, and instead think about it as an extension of an ongoing conversation we're having with fragments of mythology, legend, history, and archaeology from the past. So let me start off with just going to rapidly go through some case studies of how archaeologists do our work, the kind of stuff we find using my past published research as case studies, and to try and identify some themes that might sort of challenge that myth, that popular conception, make it a bit less secure, but also suggest some things we might be able to say instead from our evidence. So my first case study is a project I co-directed with a Swedish archaeologist, Dr. Martin Rundqvist, quite a while ago now, looking at a little-known boat grave cemetery in the Swedish province of Östergötland, which is away to the south from most of the other well-known Vendel or Merovingian period late 6th to mid 8th century boat grave cemeteries, and then the later Viking Age ones, many of which continue on those same cemeteries. You may have heard of the sites of Vendel and Valsgärde and Tuna in Alsiska, these sites that are often talked about when we're talking about boat burial. Now, this site, I think, is really interesting because it helps us to rethink the way we interpret burial in boats in the Viking Age, and helps us to think. And this is something that a lot of archaeologists have tried to tackle in various publications over the last decade. How we think about death rituals is not about disposal. That's a term we often use. It's not about getting rid of the dead. It's actually about an ongoing dialogue with the remains of the dead. And it's about trying to understand the dead in a landscape context, because death is about time. People get old and they die, or they don't get old and they die. And then you need to do something about it at a particular moment after they stop breathing, or there's vital signs, in which in the Viking Age they may not have had our medical understandings of death anyway. And so the time of death is hazy, but death is also about space. It's about where you are and where you want the dead to be. And so it's about moving the dead, transporting the dead. Death is always about space and time. And so I want to take you on a journey into Östergötland, the site of Scamby, which from this slide I hope you can see is, as I said, detached from the main concentration of Viking boat inhumation sites. Now, I want to qualify by saying there's so many different ways in which we have evidence of disposal of the dead, cremation, inhumation. Boats are only one element of the funerary practices, and this is the broader Scandinavian picture of the main boat grave cemeteries and boat inhumations that we have. And you can see that it sits off on the Baltic coast of Sweden in a very distinctive location. And it was a site that was never excavated before we got there. And the reason we were digging it, we don't just dig for fun, and we don't dig to disrespect and disturb the dead for no good reason. The reason we wanted to excavate, it was simple. No one had dug it. Everyone was assuming from the surface morphology that this was a ridge covered with a series of boat-shaped depressions, which sounds very depressing, but it simply means a series of shaped collapses that could suggest there was a boat there with a chamber over it, and then stones had been raised over that chamber, and then when it rotted, it collapsed in to create the boat-shaped depression, and surrounded by cairns. And so we mapped it for the first time with modern surface survey methods. We did a topographic survey, in other words, which had never been done since the 1920s, I think, hand-drawn sort of sketch by the national authorities for heritage in Sweden. And we did a survey, and we thought we'd dig one boat grave to at least test what the heck it was. So we decided to go on this smallest one, the smallest one because if it had been well preserved, there might have been a lot of stuff. It was unlikely because most of these things get robbed because they're pretty obvious in the landscape. But if there's anything surviving, it could be pretty well preserved. And if it's well preserved, it would be both very expensive, very time consuming, and we didn't want to disturb anything more than the bare minimum. But we did want it, so we went for the smallest, and we also went for one in the middle because we knew that this ridge of 10 boat graves, 8 in a line and 2 offset, would be we didn't know the chronology. This site could run for 500 years, for 50 years, and we wanted to pick one in the middle. Now, that won't tell us the whole range of the cemetery, but at least it won't give us an outlier. It's less likely to be an outlier if it's in the middle. And so we dug one of the boat graves. And this is us clearing the turf, and the archaeology was very shallow. Some urban archaeology from the Viking Age, such sites like the early town of Ribe and York, of course, you're looking at really deep deposits. Here, you're looking at scratching the surface, and you're down onto the cairn. And so you can see this really, this is the cairn during excavation. We left the depression of the boat intact, and we excavated the monument. This is a composite photograph from above, so you rectified, so you can see this is really odd, irregular shaped cairn of only 1 or 2 stones thick. And once we removed that, we realised we were down onto the natural surface. So it's a very shallow monument. It wasn't one of these grand burial mounds like we hear about from the Old English poem Beowulf, or from the Oseberg ship, which was covered by a massive mound. This is a very shallow and very different kind of monument. And then we investigated the boat itself, and we found a really crap boat. I mean, it was probably about 5 meters long. So it wouldn't have been something you would have been able to stuff many, even very skinny Vikings into to go on a massive raid on a Pictish monastery or something. You wouldn't get very far. Let us go raiding in my longship. And I don't have money yet, but when we've gone on the raid, we'll be able to get some more. We get a bigger ship. No, it's not. This isn't this would have been perhaps a clinker-built ship because we've got all the clench nails. But it's not a ship that would have got very far, a local fishing vessel or for local travel. But this was used, seemingly, to bury at least one or more people, but their bones didn't survive because the soil is darned acidic. It ate up all the bone. But what we did get was the stains of various iron rings and iron hooks, a knife, a single bead, and other items, including one of these frost nails and these horse additions so that the horses can ride on icy ground, which may be both practical and symbolic of a road to hell. It could hint that as well as a person, there could have been bits of or a whole horse also in this grave, but it hasn't survived. So we're working from fragments. There was no weaponry, no great armour or helmet. And one of the reasons we think there may not have been that is because we think it was nicked. We think this grave was robbed soon after. Like so many of these graves, it was probably the family doing the grave robbing, and they were coming back and taking out the things that mattered. And from parallels elsewhere, the things they would probably go and nick take back are the weapons and the armour. But what they didn't take back are these wonderful amber gaming pieces, and there's us finding that's the first one we found actually. And here they are. We've got these wonderful gaming pieces that date to the early Viking Age. And here's some of the ironwork and so on. And so what does this grave tell us? Well, it's a fragmentary grave. It's only one grave. And I want to just try to be honest that this is the example of many archaeological projects. We can't suddenly do a time team style artist reconstruction or here is exactly what it looked like, exactly what people were thinking. This is precisely how the funeral took place. We're working from small fragments. But for us, one of the things that came out of our interpretation was this is likely a masculine grave, because there was only one bead and not a string of beads. There was no weapons, but there may have been, given it was probably robbed. But the scattered gaming pieces are, unlike some archaeologists that have tried to see gaming in the early Middle Ages as all about military strategy and a martial identity. This is also about playing with the dead. This is about you taking your gaming pieces to the next life, and perhaps also hinted that this was a place where you went to maybe play games with the dead ancestor. Because if you think of it in terms of the architecture of the monument, there was only one standing stone that was probably raised over the monument. This is a very flat, shallow monument. This is us following reconstructing it. This monument was not difficult to access. It was a platform for ritual. It wasn't a big mound where you're sealing the dead in place. And so the way we're thinking about this grave is it probably had a boat, a little house, a little hut, and you would, on perhaps anniversaries, after the burial, it was a place to facilitate going back and engaging with the dead, maybe adding things, taking things away, continuing that conversation with your relative. And without going into too much further detail, the point I want to get across to you is that so much of the writing about death rituals in the Viking Age is all about pomp and ceremony. It's all about theatre. And you may be aware of the work of Neil Price, who's even argued that the elaborate funerals of the Viking Age may have inspired the very poetry that we have coming out, the skaldic poetry, that these come from funerary dirges. They come from epitaphs to the dead, performed at funerary context. And I think that's an idea he's taken from Anders Andren and others, and it's an idea that has great merit. But I think we have to temper that focus on grand procession and grand designs and monuments to be seen from afar by thinking about even the most, and this would be, I think, consider a high status burial, investing a boat, investing artifacts, but it was a place of ongoing dialogue where you revisit the grave, you interact with those remains, and even the acts of grave robbing were actually part of a social process of remembering. And this is work that has been bolstered by more recent publications by, amongst others, Ali Klevnes at Stockholm University, who's done more detailed studies than we did of this process that we find throughout the Viking world of revisiting graves. And it even has reflections in some of the legendary sources, such as Angantyr, where you have this idea of going back to the grave to retrieve objects, to then continue feuds and continue your deeds. So what I think I wanted to get across to you is that this was a robbed tomb, but it was a fragmentary set of evidence, but it still gives us clues about Viking Age attitudes and practices surrounding death. And the landscape location now is amongst well-drained agricultural fields, but we think that this was probably a semi-island location in the Viking landscape, where this ridge, which is actually boat-shaped, which may be significant in itself, would have stood out, not as a dramatic headland overlooking sea routes, but almost in a backyard near to the farms of the people who are using it. So this is about a landscape of elite power and agricultural resources, but in a landscape that was so close to the major sea routes. And these people would have been presumably both subject to Viking raids and doing their own Viking raids. They were controlling the coast. They were exploring the coast. They were raiding and trading and participating in this maritime culture, but they're burying the dead in boats away from the coast, near their most safest location you could possibly, most difficult location you could get to from that coast. So that's one case study for you. Let's quickly move on to look at another case study of work that I've looked at. And here we look at Christian Viking period art. And this helps us to think about how, at a time of complex exchange of different ethnic groups, different languages, trading, raiding, military conquest, colonization of areas where previously people hadn't settled, the Viking Age as a phenomenon is one of defined by hybridity, defined by change. There's no fixed single Viking way of death because there was no such thing as a Viking anyway, as a Viking culture, and there was no such thing as a static fixed moment where you can say, wow, this is what the Vikings were doing. And I think the hogback tombs of northern Britain, of southern and central Scotland and northern England are a good example of that. And they've been called Viking colonial monuments by Jim Lang, which I think is really not helpful. But they are a product of this shifting world where northern Britain is broken up and fragmented politically during the 10th century, and local lords and dynasties are taking on new ways of commemorating in death, and they're adopting Christian and deep-time, late antique Mediterranean practices of raising small shrines over the graves of the dead. And that's what hogbacks are. They're recumbent stone monuments, and they take many different forms. You may be familiar with some of these because some of them are not far from here. Some of them have bears and other kinds of animals as end beasts. Some of them have very distinctive roofs that allude to architecture in other forms, so they have tegulated roofs. And these are the famous ones from Brompton near Northallerton, which I think they're on display in the church, and I believe they're looking to get some funding to do some reinterpretation of these. And they're wonderful fragments, and I think, again, like a grave, they're fragment. They're not over the graves, they're moved. They were found, reused in late medieval stonework in the 19th century restoration of the church. So they're out of place. They're floating. And we don't know, therefore, how they related to any one or more graves. The most likely idea, and this is where I do agree with Jim Lang, is they probably, the fact they don't have crosses on them is no sign of them being pagan. It's because they are composite monuments, and they were probably originally intended to be framed by these crosses that sort of at either end or in some other arrangement. But what's really intriguing about these monuments is that they are a mashup of ideas that do have Scandinavian artistic and animal inspirations within that Christian converted world of Danish, Hiberno-Norse, British, as in Welsh-speaking Brythonic British, and Old English or Anglo-Saxon peoples in this Middle Britain, this northern England, southern Scottish zone in the 10th century. And this becomes a popular form of commemoration. Some of the scenes on the sides of them could be linked to Norse mythological scenes, such as the one below, maybe two versions of Tyr having his hand gnawed off by Fenrir, if you want to believe that. Or you could see it as perhaps deliberately ambiguous, that you can read that, or you cannot. You know, it's difficult to know how this would have been viewed at the time. And there are overt Christian scenes on some, such as the Gosforth Saint Stone, which does have a crucified Christ at each end, as well as scenes that could be interpreted as Thor and Jormungandr with the eye of faith. And some have, it's another example where you have overtly sort of architectural designs, you know, this sense of a roofed, canopied structure. And trying to interpret these monuments has always been a bit tricky, and people want to find a single source of inspiration. And some scholars want to see them as mainly Christian and nothing to do with the Vikings, and others want to see them as it's all about the Scandinavian presence. And I'm, as usual with most things, a bit wishy-washy and in the middle on this. Yes, I think these can be seen as inspired by insular, in other words, Anglo-Saxon or British more generally, house-shaped shrines, such as the Heatherstone from Peterborough, and other monuments, such as the Lichfield Angel here. This is part of it's probably the shrine, the second stage shrine of St. Chad from Mercy and Heartland. As well as the Jedburgh Shrine. So these are three examples from across three kingdoms, from East Anglia, Mercia, and Northumbria, of the existing tradition of Christian saints being buried in, you know, symbolic houses, elevated in house-shaped tombs. But I think that's not good enough, and I think we have to also look. That's the quote from Bede, by the way, if you care. No one should really care what anything Bede says, but if you want to, there he is, talking about Chad's tomb, an earlier version, perhaps the wooden version, being in a form of a little house. So, you know, just to say that we do have that pre-Viking tradition, but I think we also have to look to reliquaries. This is the Monimus reliquary, and it's basically the same functional relationship of these class act like animals biting down and holding down the roof. And that's exactly what some of the hogbacks at Brompton are doing. The animals they're vibrant, three-dimensional ursine. They're bears. But they're holding down the structure. They're protecting and controlling it, whilst themselves also being bound into place. And I'll talk about that in a little while. And so this is art that is supposed to be deeply meaningful. We don't know exactly how to read it, but we think what I would suggest is this is coming from a Christian animal art tradition, but it's overlapping with people of Scandinavian descent who are wanting to deploy their own specific spin on this tradition, because outside of the shrines of saints and the holy relics that would be protected by this art. And if you look at the bears at Brompton, they're not just simply big, scary bears that are trying to break into these structures. They're protective, and also they're bound. And not only bound by being muzzled, but on many of the bears, you can see they've also got a tethered forearm. At least one of them. I mean, some of them it's not clear, and some of them I'm not allowed to. Try to take any photographs in Durham Cathedral Library, and you'll have like a SWAT team of people will descend on you and tell you not to photograph. But the ones in Durham, why they're in Durham is another story. But they have this feature too. But the ones still in Brompton Church, you can see a band around the forearm, and I can't show you pictures of the ones at Durham, but at least the ones at Brompton have this feature. And what I think this is about is bound, solid space. You're creating a carved stone monument where you can't access into that space. Obviously, it's carved stone. You're painting it in vivid colours. This wouldn't have been bare stone, and inside you've got the dead. The dead are protected and they're guarded by these scary bears. But these bears are not just wild beasts. They are bound into servitude as the beasts of the desert were showed their submission to Christ. So it's a Christian idea, but being adapted into this secular medium of a protective, scary bears. And in a publication, I tried to make the point that there's no single source for this. And by the 10th century, all these different art styles and forms are playing with the idea of protective, framing beasts, from the most common female dress accessory of the Viking Age, the oval or tortoise brooches, sword hilts, saddle bows, right up to halls themselves and boat houses. The hogbacks sit in this world of different structures, buildings, containers, artifacts that are all in different ways with different functions, playing with this idea of animals actively protecting a space or a function or a person even, or in some cases vessels and whole communities. In the case of the hall symbolically, encapsulating in microcosm the social and the mythological. And so I think we need to think of the hogbacks as not as part of this hybrid world of citations to lots of different artifacts. And I'm not sure that anyone in the early Middle Ages, in the Viking Age, would go around and go, I see what they did there. They're clearly alluding to that hall we saw the other day. But I'm not saying it's such a conscious discursive practice, but I think we're living in a world where people from small items, from combs and brooches, right up to halls and pagan temples and Christian churches, we're living in a world of animals as protective symbols that are apotropaic, they are guarding and framing the dead and the living. And I think that helps us to understand the hogbacks. So from my first case study, trying to rethink boat graves, my second case study is trying to help us rethink the most familiar and often called Viking type of insular stone sculpture, the hogback stones. And there's more I could say about these, but I won't because I haven't got time. But they are really, each of them is individual. Each of them tells a different story, and we can play games and think about how they may relate to each other. But if you put the Brompton hogbacks, where they're the most hogbacks in one location, you can suggest that maybe there's a sort of genealogy of multiple generations. I mean, this is really speculative, where we can think, once you put one hogback in a place and you put crosses either side of it, maybe other people want to do so too, and the leading families of the area competing in death or referencing each other in death through the choice to add carve a hogback, in the same way as we see later dynastic tombs in churches doing the same with effigies or brasses, and indeed as we see with burial mounds in the Viking Scandinavian landscape. But that's not enough. Let's go on and do some other case studies for you, and let's deal with a controversial one. So let's look at chamber graves and mortuary theatre and go back to Scandinavia and the famous BJ 581 Viking warrior woman. And for me, I've got a different tale to tell about this grave, which generally annoys most people. It's less to do with the dead and their identity, but the role of grave goods in transforming the dead and the dead holding an agency after death. And this links back to what I said about Scandi. What I mean by that is the 2017, this is one of our great coups in popular culture. This is one of the few archaeological studies of the early Middle Ages that really went absolutely proper viral. In 2017, the AGPA study by Hedensternia et al. Was a major success for us in the world of Viking archaeology with the application of DNA to this 19th century discovery, confirming what the osteologists had already told scholars, but they didn't want to hear, that the bones of this individual in BJ 581, one of the chamber graves from the early town of Birka in Sweden, was not that of a typical Viking warrior, but the bones were that of a biological woman, of a biological female, and that therefore this opens up new interpretations of how we understand this. One of the graves, over 1,100 graves found from Birka, excavated from an estimated 3,000. And it's been in all the books, all the publications as a typical Viking warrior because it's got all the weapons. You've got a sword, an axe, you've got gaming pieces, you've got two spears, you've got shields, you've got a vessel, you've got horse stirrups, and you've got 2 sacrificed horses. And this 2017 study hit the perfect storm of gender archaeology, gender debates, racial debates about Vikings and national story, origin myths. It sort of did all the tricks, right? And that's why it became so viral. So there was lots of in the manosphere, people just couldn't hack it, and it just broke people's minds that there could have been women operating in a military capacity in the early Middle Ages, through to skeptics such as me, and saying, well, hang on, let's not jump to conclusions. There's many other ways of interpreting these graves. And so the article made the point, the argument of the article was that, and this is quotes directly from that 2017 article, that this one warrior grave, BJ 581, stands out as exceptionally well furnished. The grave included all those items that I said. Though some Viking women buried with weapons are known, a female warrior of this importance has never been determined, and Viking scholars have been reluctant to acknowledge the agency of women with weapons. And there's a lot packed into these scientific articles, and with students I sort of pick apart the wording chosen for this kind of study. But this is what they said. And they made the point that similar associations of women buried with weapons have been dismissed, arguing that the armaments could have been heirlooms, carriers of symbolic meaning, or grave goods reflecting the status and role of the family rather than the individual. And they cite Dr. Jorvik Viking from his 2013 study there. Now, they did an artist's reconstruction to put sort of flesh on the bones. So art is really important here. These are the original grave plans of this grave, and they here show that she had a hat with a sort of tassel with a silver ornament on it. You can see the bow, and you can get more of a sense. This artist's reconstruction gives you more of a sense of the grave. And of course we have hints from written sources of female presence in early raids, Eastern references to women dressed as men on battlefields, and there's been various debates about later saga literature and powerful women represented in them, and in the visual material evidence for women perhaps in male dress, and various later sagas and mythological sources. So this has been part of an ongoing debate, which I made the mistake of wading into via my blog by saying that, of course, the problem is that archaeologists have never called these warrior graves outside of the strange niche that is Viking archaeology, because weapons are symbolic items, they're martial items, they're hunting items, they're used in a range of different combinations in the early Middle Ages to articulate an identity in death that need not be primarily about the status of a warrior. And also, I took exception to the argument that the burial location necessarily, because it was near the hill fort at Berka, must have meant it was a warrior weapon burial. There's also questions about whether the grave was complete, and I also questioned whether the grave was all male, as they claimed, because horses are elite transportation for men and women and all manner of other people in the Viking Age, and don't need to be seen as exclusively male or martial. Horses are an item, a key item of transportation for the elite. That gaming pieces and other grave goods they're claiming are military, I'm not sure are. And I don't think, as I said earlier, I don't think gaming pieces should be seen primarily as about military strategy. And also, one of the key points that they didn't discuss at all in 2017 was gender fluidity. And this was a point that many were raising at the time. How can, yes, it's important to combine the biological and the cultural evidence, but, not everyone was either a man or a woman in different periods of the past. And so, we live in a world where the women are perhaps, we have to remember that we're living in a world in the Viking Age, not now, and now actually, where women's roles in relation to death rituals are very complex. And there are hints not only of women in battle, but women who may have taken on a whole range of active roles in dealing with the dead and configuring death ritual. And so it's not simply about denying the agency of the person's identity in the grave, but who was actually performing the funeral. And we have also debates about various seers' graves, but possible ritual specialists that have been long discussed by Neil Price and others, including the Tricrona, I can't say this name, sorry, I'll need a Dane to do this, Isa. But you have a grave here. This is from an artist reconstruction by Miroslav Kozma for the work of Jorvik Viking, which shows you an individual who's buried with a staff, which is this kind of symbolic spear. So this is a grave of a high status, dog and horse sacrifice, a woman who may have had a special role. And one of our items was a seer staff that had militaristic allusions. So this is a symbolic Valkyrie's grave, maybe. Not saying that this person actually went to battlefields and chose the slain for Odin, but this is someone who's been, at least in death, is being given some kind of specialist identity, if not in life, that's linked to a martial roles, but not necessarily about going into the battle and hacking heads off, but had a much more perhaps ritualized role in death. And of course, we have the Horby pendant, which shows a person in sort of female attire, but wielding a sword and shield. And this stuff has now been widely discussed in the archaeological literature, but it leads us back to this debate about whose identity is being articulated here. And I don't think it's entirely outrageous and misogynistic to suggest that a rich, elaborate, high-status burial, like the one at Scamby and here, it's not about composing an identity for what they would have wanted in life or how they're like snapshotting them. Like, as you know, we must put these items here to capture something of their individual identity. We've probably got multiple individuals involved in composing these funerals for a big audience, in which this person may have had an identity that they may have lived their life as a woman and been a military commander, as Hedensternia et al. Suggest, but they also might have had a very specialised ritual role, and this is articulated in their treatment in a martial capacity in the grave. And I think there's different ways we interpret this, but I think one of the interesting things is that this is a grave that is a chamber. This is a space that's almost like a living space for the dead. And thinking about it in terms of the prominent location in the Birka landscape, I think this is about creating an identity for someone in death that's going to live on and almost act as a protector for that settlement. And I think this takes a different mindset that from the way we've been thinking about this grave and others as simply like equivalents to portraits, you know, an artistic portrait. Well, let's render them as they would like to have been. No, I think they're rendering the dead, they're creating an identity for the dead, for what they want the dead to do for the living moving forward. And I think that's a very non-Western, non-modern way of thinking about death that I think we're still, still got hang-ups about. That people are creating, transforming, using grave goods to create not simply describe or reflect the biography of their lived life, but to create something new from that person. And actually, the TV show Vikings may be closer to the mark with this portrayal of a vision in one scene, season 5, part 1, of Lagertha's role of fighting skeletal warriors, which is never really explained, but like so much in the rather, as Esau says, rather flaming, whatever his phrase was, the mess that is these TV shows. But I think it does, for my purposes, help to capture the idea of what maybe Viking era people were doing with these rich weapon burials, whether they were biological males or biological females. That they're trying to create ancestors in the landscape to preside over that space, to control that space, to guard for the living, to act for the living. And that leads us nicely to my fourth case study, which is the archaeology of our Viking worlds. Because one of the things I've been doing in recent years has been doing an archaeology of the TV shows, which is a rather not necessarily very. I'm not making friends by doing this, because a lot of archaeologists were involved in being historical consultants for these TV shows. And there's reenactors and craftspeople who contribute and were commissioned to do this work to create this vivid multi-season Viking world. And I have so many people who just say, well, it was all rubbish. And other people who say, yeah, this is the way it was, guys. And I take a kind of, again, wishy-washy middle road, but I try and look at it as how this is a really important moment where we can see for the first time 2 TV shows back to back, and then we can add The Last Kingdom in if you want to, but I can't talk about it here. We have 2 major TV shows back to back, Vikings and Vikings Valhalla, that do capture over many hours, I think I counted it as somewhere, over 60 hours of television. They take us into an immersive Viking world. And while I wouldn't defend it, and there's lots of nonsense in it and lots of eye-rolling moments from me as an academic, and I'm sure from you as enthusiasts, it does allow us to connect in terms of the way they portray the funerals, performance and place. They blend legend, history and archaeology into this fantasy world that's not really intended to be taken as a historical drama, more as a homage to the Viking Age and to the legends and history about it. And one of the key things I think we do have to positively take away from the TV show is how much emphasis they put on the emotions of death. Now, those emotions are very much our kind of sentiments about death, But I think the TV show does try to deal with death as more than simply about the performance and grand gestures, and about real relationships between the living and the dead. So I contributed an article with Ali Cleveness to this edited collection in 2019 by Paul Hardwick and Kate Lister on Vikings and the Vikings, which is the most ridiculously great title of any book ever, but you have to sort of look for the italics of Viking, the first Vikings being the title of the TV show, and the Vikings being the early medieval period. And I've also, in other publications, I've sort of reviewed how the TV show deals with death and how it draws on historical sources and archaeological information to show death in a variety of ways. And while each of these individual funerals, including the suspiciously motorised, fast-moving funerary ship of Aslog here in season 4, part 2, where it's sort of, and flaming arrows in setting the boat alight. While that all may be a bit ridiculous, there are elements here which are grounded in the archaeological record: the provision of food, the care and attention to process and moving the dead, the killing of animals, and water being important. And we see this. Every funeral is different, and while there's a lot of speculation and details, such as this riverside burial of one of the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok with a mast or some kind of an animal skulls. I don't know how they managed to have the time to deflesh all these animal skulls, but let's not think too carefully about it. But the point is, it does capture something of our archaeological evidence from sites like Repton and so on. And we see the same thing with their representation of Iceland. While they have lots of critical problems with their representation of Iceland, the funerals are, I think, with this kind of weird wicker boat, are not exactly grounded in precise archaeological evidence, but take a creative approach and an emotional approach and an intimate approach. So as well as all the materials and the performance, there is that connection of the living and the dead. And of course they dedicate almost an entire episode to the funeral, and this is the plot spoiler, of Lagertha, where we see the sacrifice of horses on snow and a boat cremation on ice. It sounds like some kind of production we should see at the Birmingham NEC or something, but it is actually, whatever one may think of the details, including the human sacrifice, the priests. These are all priests who just come out of nowhere. We don't see where they live and what they do, but there they are for the funeral. And, there is those intimate connections of her granddaughter speaking the last words to the cadaver of Lagertha and seeing through the ice at her, what we imagine, the child imagines, is Lagertha's reuniting with Ragnar. So you have this very emotional, tear-jerky, as well as all the theatre. And I think it's not to be sniffed at, it's not to be mocked. This is producing a whole new death culture of thinking about the Viking Age in our world. And I think in that sense, this deserves not necessarily respect, we don't have to enjoy it, but I think it deserves our critical attention, because this is now how most people are thinking about the Viking Age. And then Björn's megalithic tomb is just out of this world, a mixtures of the Neolithic with Ravenna and its mosaics of the tomb of Theodoric, and it's very much unashamedly creating a sort of mythological, legendary death of someone on his horse, very much like the Rökstone speaks of the statue of Theodoric. So you have this idea of death in the Scandinavian landscape that's utterly implausible in archaeological terms, but does speak to many of the themes that we find in the history, the legends, and the archaeology. And this is the most silly, but also I just can't let it go without mentioning it. At the end, again, plot spoiler, at the end of Vikings Valhalla, season 3, Queen Emma, the funeral of Canute. So he has a double funeral. He gets buried in Winchester Cathedral and Minster, but also his wife knows he really wants to die like a Viking. And what does that mean? Going to the White Cliffs of Dover with one servant, single flaming arrow, and there is Canute going off like his ancestors, like a Viking. And it's ridiculous, but it's also just shows the power of that trope in our popular culture. And so I've got a forthcoming paper looking at season 5 of Vikings and the funerals in it, and I probably should wrap up there. But I wanted to just capture for you how archaeologists don't have all the answers. We're working with fragments. New evidence is coming up all the time. But our responsibility is to not only just look at the data and say, oh, we think it's this, but also to think about the responsibility of those stories to our world today, to be in conversation with specialist audiences, people who are interested, faith groups, creatives, about new ways we can tell these stories for people today from our evidence. And I think that's where I'm just really delighted to be here and share some thoughts about death in the Viking Age and our mortuary archaeologies of the Vikings that we're creating for the small screen and the big screen. Thank you.
Sadly, we're all going to die. But while you're waiting, why not follow Archaeodeath? Subscribe now on YouTube.